Here is the illustration from the results of the first 5-year plan. The artist is Varvara Stepanova, and this is a photo montage that was created in 1932, kind of like a collage, but using not just photos but also other pieces as well besides photos. And the purpose of it for her was to answer some questions. Soviet Union was still considered very young in 1932, and they had to kind of contend with the terms of how to represent the people as the cornerstone of legitimacy of the state when it was a totalitarian dictatorship at that point. They're trying to show that this is a movement of the people when it's really not. So it's trying to translate the notion of the popular will into a visual form. It's trying to portray mass movements and societal change, and ultimately how to use a poster as an effective tool for mass persuasion and mobilization, basically propaganda. So this piece are all of those things. The state required a fast and easy, efficient conduit to reach the multitudes. They did use Soviet socialist realism. There's some really good examples in East Berlin that I saw of communist propaganda that still exists. It's a mural that's really an interesting on site of an old Eastern Berlin government building. But this is one where they want to be able to disseminate the propaganda on a wide scale. And it's definitely got an artistic flair for it. I really think it's an interesting piece. So with the historical context, first of all, the main dominating person in this piece is clearly Vladimir Lenin. It's interesting that he's included because if this is made in 1932, he had died 8 years before in 1924. So you would think that the dominating figure of this photo montage should be Joseph Stalin, who is the dictator at this point. But remember, this is propaganda. So they're trying to mobilize and show that this is the will of the people. And so they wanted to say, well, that began with Lenin, and Stalin's just building off of that. And so that's why Lenin is given such a prominent spot in this piece. So Lenin's government united much of the old Russian Empire by, into the Soviet Union in 1922 when the Civil War was over. And then Lenin was going to launch his new economic policy, or the NEP, which is the policy where it allowed some capitalist ventures while still remaining under a communist system where the state controls everything. Really what this was allowing for very small scale capitalism in a communist country. The way Lenin described it, and those of you who've had me before may remember this, but it's like the way Lenin tried to justify allowing capitalism is saying we're taking 2 steps backward towards capitalism, and then after that it succeeds, we'll end up being 1 step ahead. So that's why he's going to allow for that to happen. It wasn't really popular. Even Trotsky, his biggest supporter, was not a fan of it. However, it is going to stabilize the nation and allow for the USSR to kind of grow. The economy grew during that small-scale capitalism before Lenin died. But when Lenin dies in 1924, Stalin gets rid of that, and it turns to pure communism. And he initiated his first 5-year plan in 1928. And this 5-year plan had exceedingly high goals where it seemed like they were impossible to attain, and yet they did. aim of the first 5-year plan, meaning there's going to be more, is that they needed to build an industrial state, because up until Lenin's death, this is really still largely an agrarian society. So they're going to be moving all of these people into the cities and putting them in factories and industrializing using heavy industry, improving the transportation system. And then those who remained in the farms, they're going to start collectives, or no more private farms, but you're farming with all of your produce going to the state, and you have to buy from the state even though you grew it. So wasn't really popular, but it was exceedingly successful. China tried to do this, or at least something similar, and they failed miserably and led to famine. And then also in the Ukraine, it also failed miserably and led to famine and the death of many, many, many Ukrainians. But at least in the northern part of the Soviet Union, it's going to be hugely successful. So it brought all economic activity under government control. And so this piece was created at the end of the first 5-year period. And we can see what the artist is trying to show in regards to what they have done. So we can see the power stations. That's pretty dominant in this piece, right next to Lenin's head. So the power stations and electricity is vital for industrialization. They're also including tons of workers, both male and female, throughout this piece. And they're going to expand mining, and railroads were built. One thing that we don't necessarily notice in this piece is that, even though it's considered a successful plan, the people suffered greatly. They didn't, their standards of living did not improve, and in many cases got worse, because as they moved them into the cities, they weren't ready for the amount of people to live there. And so living conditions were extremely unhealthy and crowded and cramped, and not enough water or sanitation. And so it wasn't good for the people, but it's vital for the propaganda for the purpose of the propaganda to show that it's working. And so that's why there was so much like, oh, everything's wonderful, everything's great propaganda, because they needed to show that the people were all in this together type thing. So there also was heavy censorship of the arts. So this one is clearly not going to criticize anything that has to do with Stalin, let alone the Soviet Union. And so much of the art that was created was completely propaganda for the state under Stalin. And in fact, a lot of the photographs that were done during Lenin's time, people who were part of the revolutions or the Civil War, all of a sudden started getting erased from official photographs but Stalin stayed in them. So there was a lot of propaganda that it was Stalin who was the clear person to follow, but he stood on the shoulder of the giant Lenin. So this is considered constructivist art, where art is a social product conditioned by its social I lost my spot. Oh, yeah, by the social environment. It does borrow ideas from Cubism. There's also some things called suprematism and futurism, but at its heart, this is an entirely new approach to making fine art. It's where one seeks to abolish the traditional concern with composition. This is a construction. It's not a composition. They're adding pieces. It's just a collage. So constructivists experimented with new architectural materials and assembled them in a way devoid of historical reference. And Stepnova was part of that. And they saw the new Russia as an idealistic center from the historic reference and decoration. Constructivists also designed buildings with no precise facades. There was an emphasis that was placed on the dramatic use of materials to create projects. Constructivists particularly were influenced by the modern industrial complexes that dominated human employment in the early 20th century. So this is graphic art for propaganda purposes. It's considered a double-page spread in a book, and there's some things that are also really significant to note. The color red, that is clearly a sign for communism. It dominates the communist flag. You also see these letters right here, CCCP. Those are the Cyrillic alphabet letters for USSR, or Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, sorry. And there's also a number 5 right here, which is denoting the 5-year plan. And there is somewhat of the abstraction of the crowds, almost into patterns or into backgrounds, which becomes a ground over the figure of the mass head, the massive head of Lenin. It's not a god or a monarch, because remember, if you guys remember, the Soviet Union became an atheist, officially atheist. This is supposed to be like the leader is the superior individual. And it's basically perceived that all of this belongs to the people. So it's also must be perceiving as possessing, Lenin was possessing superior vision, persuasive skills, and charisma. But they're still using him 8 years after his death to call out to people. By skewing the conventional perpendicular axis and making this more of like a diagonal, it's going to design, it'll conjure for the viewer a swirling sensation that's interrupted by a crowd marching towards the viewer at the bottom, because they're supposed to be sharing a collective enthusiasm. So this is still in Moscow, Russia, and Stepanova was the main figure in the Russian avant-garde movement, and so it's a interesting piece that we get to study for this one, because we don't necessarily look at communist art and say, okay, this is fine art. So I think that this is an interesting choice. And if you ever did see other types of Soviet propaganda, it's also, you see a lot of the same themes.